These are mascots.
Listen to the
And we're
countdown.
live. It is Tuesday. It is April the 29th, which is to say one day after April the 28th, on which there was no show, one day before April 30th. It is 8 o'clock a.m., the year of our Lord 2025, and I have to start today with an abject apology. Because while I informed the broader Dogshirt TV universe that there would be no show yesterday, and I included it on my in the newsletter. I mentioned it on the show. I did all the normal due diligence. There were two people I did not specifically inform that there would be no show. Now, one of them,
I read your newsletter.
yeah, well, so Holly knew, but one person who did not know was yesterday's guest, whom I'm going to leave unnamed because he has graciously rescheduled. And, I don't want to sort of like out him as somebody who, I grossly inconvenienced yesterday. The other person, but my heartfelt apologies for our guest showing up only to have no show. The other person is the estimable Alicia Wanless, who is the co-host who invited said guest. I didn't bother to mention to her I was canceling the show. And so we had a co-host and a guest show up, and there was only one problem. It was 5 a.m. where I was, and I was asleep, and there was no show. And I was resting assured that I had alerted everybody to the fact that there was no show. Everybody, that is, except the host and the guest, who were there.
I have just some commentary.
Yeah.
Add on, if that's okay. I think the moral of this whole story is that I am the best member of the co-host community, because not only did I know there was no show because I read your newsletter and I was on the Friday thing, but also myself and Alicia are the only ones who actually use and pay attention to the spreadsheet, the scheduling spreadsheet.
I was coming to the spreadsheet because this error of mine was doubly, shall we say, deplorable, because Alicia Wanless actually built a spreadsheet that tracks guests and who's, so had I bothered to look at the schedule, as I did today, I would have known A, that there was a guest, B, that Alicia was co-hosting, and therefore C, that I should probably alert them that I was canceling the show. Never mind any of that. The guest has so graciously agreed to reschedule for a different day. Alicia was stressed out about other things yesterday anyway and only had a modest amount of time to be irritated at me. And so all is well that ends well, which brings me to the second matter I wanted to discuss in today's monologue, which is that, the country went to the polls yesterday, and the entire nation rose up to say fuck you to Donald Trump. And there was only one problem with this uprising, which is that it took place in Canada. But the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, lost his seat.
He lost his shit.
Well, that too, but I was actually going to stick with the facts. And, we are going to have a lot to say about the Canadian election results some other day. But for now, I just want to say, Trumpism was on the ballot and it was found wanting. And I watched the CBC election returns last night until I fell asleep. And it was a satisfying thing to see, the returns from Prince Edward Island come in. And, you know, so I just want to say to all of our Canadian co hosts, friends, family, uh, you did good.
The
Um,
cactus is putting his hands up in approval.
yeah. Um, all of which brings us to the point, which is that the sun is shining, the birds are chirping. It's going to be a great day. And Cactus, do your thing.
We're watching Dog Shirt TV, an effing revolution in morning television.
You are watching Dog Shirt TV, and it
Go
is
Canada! Oh, sorry.
an effing revolution
Anyway,
in morning
not
television.
fancy.
And one of the revolutionary features, of which there are many, is that sometimes Holly tries to do improv with the cactus.
And it doesn't.
The cactus, it doesn't really work all the time. Um, Another one of the revolutionary features is that occasionally you have a guest who has to sit through one of these weird monologues, and the
6 minutes.
screen freezes at precisely the moment he has a bewildered expression on his face. And That is really satisfying because you actually have to extend the monologue because you don't know if he's able to speak or if he's in some. And then he snaps out of it all of a sudden with a big grin. We're not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have the estimable Alan Elrod. Holly, why don't you introduce our guest, whom I have not importuned by not showing up the day that he was on the schedule that only Holly and Alicia use as it is intended, and the rest of us feel admonished to begin doing so immediately.
All right. Well, Alan is I would say, in the expanded bulwark pro-democracy universe. That's how I met him at Principles First a few years ago. And he is the
I'm not
president.
allowed to go to Principles First, Alan, because I have no principles, and so I can't put them first. So I'm banned.
Anyway, we have a good time without you. He's the president and CEO of the Pulaski Institution in Arkansas. He's based in Arkansas, and is kind of a guru of kind of red state democracy, but I'll let him, or the struggle for red state democracy, I should say. He's also a contributing editor at Liberal Currents, a great publication that is doing so well, and including publishing incredibly brilliant writers, such as a wonderful person named Holly Berkley Fletcher, and he's a columnist at Art Digital. So I will let him tell us more about the Pulaski Institution and what all he is up to there in the red state, my husband's home state of Arkansas. And I'm wearing my Oklahoma. You have a lot of Oklahoma connections. I'm wearing my Sooners sweatshirt.
It's a little less acceptable now that they've joined the SEC for you to be wearing that.
It's embarrassing, Alan. That's diplomatic of you to say, but it's just embarrassing.
Blue pig, but
Yeah.
welcome, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, I am in Arkansas, like you said. The organization that I started is called the Pulaski Institution, and our focus is on heartland areas. And we take a kind of dynamic attitude towards that. We don't think it's just sort of like rural farm country. We take it as anywhere really away from these kind of key major centers of finance and politics and power. And we also take an international approach. We're really interested in what's going on in wealthy democracies, not just the US. So yeah, the American South, the Midwest, but upstate New York, Maine, the prairie provinces in Canada, regional Australia, the north of England, all these places where a certain kind of politics has emerged that is, I think, rubbed raw by status anxiety, a little bit antipathy. There's antipathy, if not outright angst towards globalization, a certain hostility towards the sort of consensus politics that I think are good, right? Liberal pluralism and those things. And so that's our interest. Our interest is both to try to understand that and also try to do stuff there. We just did an event actually in Oklahoma City last week. It was fun. I was there with a couple professors from University of Oklahoma and one from Oklahoma State, talking about democracy, talking about how people can get engaged there. We're going to be trying to do more. We're doing a second round of our conference this fall at Hendrix College in Conway, which is just outside Little Rock. And that one is going to be pretty frontal in terms this time. Last time we did a whole bunch of stuff about democracy and place and things, which we're interested in. This time we're going to really go at the problem of rising fascism in the United States and how we can address that and the challenges that presents both nationally and then yeah, fully frontal, Jeff, and then locally, with what's going on, because it's not just the challenge, right, of Trump in the White House. There's some severe issues going on at the states. I saw someone ask, I am not in Bentonville. I'm in Bryant. I'm just outside Little Rock. But
I think you're moving to Hot Springs, are you not?
moving to Hot Springs.
Yeah, that's my husband's
That's
hometown. We'll hang
some
out.
pricey that's some choice property. But
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
only about 40 minutes away, so it's nice that I can get there.
But you're moving to Hot Springs, is that right?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I'm
Yeah.
moving to Hot Springs. My wife would be happy with that. Honestly, she loves Hot Springs.
My in-laws have a very beautiful property on the lake.
Oh yeah, we have a friend with a house on the lake. That's a fun.
Anyway,
So tell me about your background. How does one come to be the director, the executive director, the president, whatever, of an institute, a sort of think tank devoted to the non-centers of power? Just as a think tank person in one of the centers of power, I just want to say that would be tough to raise money for, right? Like,
well, we're still
you know,
trying. We're
yeah,
we're
no,
very
no,
so we're always happy to get some help in that area. I got the
no, because
job.
like
by
one of the
starting.
things, I mean, I'm just going to be candid about this. One of the things all DC think tanks do is they talk about, and they talk to donors about how they have impact, and our audiences are the people with power, and they blah 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 blah. And if you self-consciously remove yourself from those places, which is of course a choice, it's much harder to make that argument, which is frankly the argument that, in my experience anyway, makes the hearts go pitter patter of donors. And so I'm just kind of interested in what your background is and how you came to be doing what you're doing.
Sure. I was lucky to get the job by starting it, so I could give myself I could give myself whatever title I want, I guess. Background is, I think the motivation here is a synthesis of my personal background and my academic. I studied when I was thinking I was just going to be an academic. I studied nationalism. I was actually doing Hungarian nationalism back in 2013 when it wasn't
As
quite
one
as
does.
attractive. Yeah, it wasn't. I was, one of those things
you were
where
studying it, not doing it. You were studying it. You weren't a Hungarian nationalist.
No,
correct?
yeah. I was
he
studying it.
left
I was
that
writing
to
about
Gorka.
yeah, I was writing about Hungarian nationalism, and it's one of those things where you're cursed to have what you studied become relevant, right? So that was fun to go from this obscure thing to suddenly Tucker
Did
Carlson's
Rob Dreher call you up and be like, I read your dissertation and I was inspired by it.
So
I'm moving
Rod has
to
actually written
Budapest.
a long piece before about how he's really not mad at me, in which he suggested that I may have inhaled too much fumes from my Arkansas chicken farms. He was very angry with me for suggesting that there was something dilettantish about all these people gathering in Scruton cafes to talk about their love of tyranny. So but yeah, so Rod is actually, Rod and I have had some personal exchanges. Gladden Papin actually is from Little Rock, which I found out when he DM'd me to let me know he was from Little Rock. But yeah, so I was doing nationalism or studying nationalism, and that was kind of the route I thought I was on. And as everything kept unfolding, the personal background I have of growing up in Arkansas and being, I think, quite passionate about places that are not the center, and then the academic interest I had in these dynamics of nationalism as a force in politics and sort of what was happening in terms of anti-liberal ideas all kind of came together. The anecdote I tell people when it comes to some of that is being in New York at a drinks event, and talking to someone, and this person who was Ivy educated, wonderful, brilliant, asked me where Arkansas was, and they weren't being rude about it. They weren't trying to be rude, and it was a really devastating moment for me to be like, "Oh, you don't even know where my state is." That actually and it hurt, and then I
Did
didn't
the
want to.
person know it was a state, or did they think was it like confusion? Like if you asked which Georgia somebody's dealing with, or
No,
was
they knew it
it,
was a state.
that they
Yeah.
thought, oh, he studies Hungary and he's from Arkansas. Maybe they thought it was Central European or something. What
Yeah,
was the,
it has that flavor, maybe. No, they knew it was a state. They were just like, "Where is it?" And I told them, but it was yeah, it was one of
the
those
most
moments that
interesting
really
thing about that
rocks you.
story is they weren't embarrassed by the question.
Exactly. They weren't embarrassed by the question. They weren't trying to be disrespectful, but they also were just like, "I don't know where it is." And I just thought, this kind of stings, right? To realize that people in these other places, like, they don't think about you at all. The Don Draper "I don't think about you" meme. That's how it felt in that moment. It's like, oh, okay. They don't even think about me. And so I think that's never left me, that sense of like, these places really do get forgotten. There's a kind of cheap culture war way of talking about that, but there is also a really sincere way of talking about it that's important.
How would you distinguish between the two?
One is, I don't think it's always malice. People out here have sometimes a conspiratorial sense that the elites in these places are conspiring against them. And I actually think it's much more benign neglect. That there's that a lot of times there's just not a sense of understanding, and there's not a sense of really knowing what is needed in places like this. And I think you have to have the attitude that the things that sometimes upset people in these places, that's sort of the red meat stuff about the liberal centers, I don't actually want to rail against, right? I like multiculturalism. Immigration's great. It's also good for us. We are not a non-diverse part of one of the largest Marshallese communities in the United States exists in Arkansas. Um, but it does matter that there's a sense in which we're never in the front of people's minds in these places, because that creates a dynamic where we're an afterthought. And when that happens, you can very quickly arrive at a place where political resentments are stoked.
So I mean, you're speaking very empathetically about your home state,
Mm-hmm.
and my sort of adopted home state, as well, which I do appreciate, and I strive for that in my own heart. But at the same time, you've written some very tough pieces about Southern democracy or lack thereof, and the sort of dysfunction in these states, which of course the voters pick over and over and over again.
They do.
So how do you sort of thread that needle?
I think you're never going to win any political argument or project without a degree of empathy, or without a degree of attempting to understand what's happening in a place. So if that's not there, like, I think you're starting from a failed position. But yeah, I've been tough on it. I hope most people understand it as tough love, but it is tough. I think, the PC reference at the Bulwark, I make the argument that the South has a frankly relatively unbroken tradition of authoritarian politics, that the liberal democracy never really took root in the South, that we went from a slaveocracy to a Jim Crow system. And then there was a period, sort of for a flicker, in the 70s and 80s where, as the Democratic Party adopted much more plural, much more sort of the attitudes that it has today, and it still was viable in the South, you had governors like, Carter and Clinton. And then pretty quickly we reverted right back into a system where not only are Southerners very comfortable with roughly one party politics, which is not particularly good for democracy, but they're also pretty comfortable with governments that are willing to put quite a lot of impositions on people's rights and liberties. And so, yeah, I think that culture is deeply historically rooted, and I find it terrible for the region. I think it's hurt us for the entirety of our history, and yeah, I mean, I don't see any reason to sort of mince words about that, right? It doesn't mean I think every Southerner is evil. I don't want to do a hee-haw thing about the South, but the facts are, I think, pretty clear that the traditions of liberal democracy have never been robust here.
And in the same article, you make the point, and I dovetailed on your article as well, that these trends, like Southern style politics, has really gone national in a way, and Southern and religion too has gone national in a way, and so basically, right now we're kind of living in a nationalized form of that. So maybe that's why people should care, right?
Yeah, I mean, that you can't get away from how big the South's influence is on the country. In the early years of the American Republic, obviously had a huge influence. And today, look, you're talking about a region now where a lot of people are moving. The population growth is in the Sun Belt. So if you if you want to talk about where a lot of the things that are directing people, the future of our politics are happening, it's in this area. And so if you're not paying attention, like, you're missing where, whether you like it or not, a lot of the future of American politics is going to come from. And so if we don't reform the region, if we don't kind of try to build better politics here, it's not going to happen nationally. Yeah, and the nationalization of Southern politics, this is like not an idea that's necessarily original to me. Heather Cox Richardson has written really elegantly about this, right, and how the South won the Civil War. And I think plenty of other scholars have indicated it in other works. But I do think, generally speaking, right now we're at a moment where people should understand the deeply American traditions of the tyrannies we're facing. I love making references to other points in time. I've also got other essays out recently that talk about 1930s Germany, and that talk about the Roman Republic. All of which I think are actually very useful to talk about, but it's also important to talk about the very American touch points and touchstones of the moment as well, and they're there.
Yeah, so how do you understand, in that context, the southern states that have tacked in more complicated directions of late? For example, North Carolina, Georgia, which has weirdly elected two liberal senators, and of course went for Biden. It does seem like there are significant countercurrents in the South that complicate the picture that you're describing.
Absolutely. And in some ways, they reflect the national dynamics we're seeing of both urban-rural divides and the education divide emerging, right? Georgia and North Carolina are great examples of this, right? Georgia is basically the Atlanta metro versus the rest of the state. A little bit Savannah. North Carolina has, right, Charlotte, but also has the Triangle, which is just, an incredible region of educational, right, advancement and really great institutions. So in some ways, these states are perfect models for how those divides are emerging in the country, because they have, these really dynamic cities, and they also have these really successful and important educational institutions, tertiary institutions, that are driving research and creating, more of that sort of educated population that right now is now a pretty key wedge point. So I think you can talk about it in both directions, right? You can talk about the southernification, right, of the U.S., but you could also look at how those national dynamics are playing out in southern states, and the ones where I think they're most applicable probably are Georgia and North Carolina. In Arkansas, we just don't have a huge city. I mean, the Little Rock metro is about 800 something thousand, but that's the metro. That's pretty dispersed. The city itself is about 200,000, and it's our biggest city. We're not a very urbanized state. We do have universities, but the University of Arkansas is tucked up in the Northwest, and then Hendrix College, which is probably our best liberal arts college, is not large. And so those dynamics, I don't think, are as felt in a state like Arkansas because there's not as much. Frankly, they're just not as played out here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think of there are a bunch of one-party states in the United States, right?
Yes.
And the South is not unique at all in, I mean, there aren't really two viable parties in Wyoming or Vermont, although the Vermont Republican Party does sometimes elect a governor, but it's including, I think, now. But there is something block-like about the dominance of the Southern Republican Party, and it creates a kind of critical mass that is real, and has mostly wiped out the commercial Northeastern Republicans who are basically either now Democrats or Wall Street, rent seekers of one sort or another. What do you attribute that to? The fact that a kind of an ideology around regional ethnic conservatism is so persistent in these states.
Well, I mean, one is that the tradition of not having a lot of party competition is so rooted, right? It's so much deeper here, right? I think but Arkansas, if you go read the VO Key Jr. book, right, the quintessential mid-century study of the South, we're the state he holds up as what he calls pure one-party politics. So there's that element. There's just a deeper comfort, I think, even compared to other states where there's one-party dynamics in the moment. The racial element is critical. It's how the South has always sustained its power structures. Always, right? And it's always been both a race and a class dynamic, right? Particularly, it was this kind of historically rooted tradition of Southern planter class leveraging, right, their position to gather and rally poor whites to their cause, usually using race as the dividing line. And so I think what's happened in the South is that's been pretty successful. And what it cultivates is an insularity, but it also cultivates a sense in which we talk a lot now, I think, about the idea that everything is culture war. I think that is a very Southern thing, because what you have is this sense in which every issue becomes a point at which your Southernness and the kind of ways of the South must be defended.
It's heavily religious too. Like
exactly.
The religion piece is huge, huge. Even for people, even as the nation grows more secular, you see Southerners who never go to church will call themselves evangelical, white
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's also part of the sort of post-Civil War consensus. The South basically said, okay, we lost the war. We'll defend the cultural identity of the region to the death, right? And that stays. And so I think that, the religious dynamic is also incredibly fascinating, right? Where like you said, you get people who are not religious. I know so many people like this around here. They don't live religious lives. They don't live deeply spiritual lives. They might go to church, but they are capital C Christian. And what that really means is they're not Northern. They're not Jewish. I mean, that also has to be said. That's part of the wedge point. It's not always there, but it is there. They're not.
By which you mean they are anti-Semites, or
Depends.
that they're what's that?
It depends.
But when you say not Jewish, I mean most of the country isn't Jewish. We're 2% of the population, and we're
Right.
crowded in cities. What does self-consciously not Jewish mean in the context of Arkansas?
Not part of the financial establishment. Not New York. Not specifically. Normally it means really not New York.
Okay, so it is pretty, you know, it is inflected by a sort of we're not those rootless cosmopolitans.
Absolutely. 100%. The Klan, people like the Klan's violence against African Americans was horrendous, but the Klan also was very virulently, anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic. And those are the other big things that, there are some states where that's a little more complicated. Louisiana has plenty of Catholics, but generally speaking, Southerners are often articulating a whole host of things in opposition to them. Even when they make a strictly positive identity claim, right? I'm Christian. It also usually implicitly means I'm not these other things.
So how do you break through that? Especially I find in my circles too, the religion piece of it really makes it intractable because and then my southern, red state folk are deeply like missionaries religious, like the most religious of the religious. And the religion piece makes it so intractable because they've so married their belief in terms of what God wants them to do with Republican politics. And so, it makes it just, and that's why I just saw the new PRRI poll, and like Trump has really slipped in the polls, and almost I think every group that he, sort of was part of his support base, or every group of voters who voted for him, except for white evangelicals, have slipped, and white evangelicals really have not slipped. And it's this like complete, cognitive. I mean, I've just never met people more cognitively stubborn than white evangelicals. So how do you sort of approach this? And what is your strategy at the Pulaski Institute? Because I mean, it seems like you're sort of gathering intellectuals in these areas to talk about things, but are you also like trying to reach, is your strategy sort of to collate and activate the sort of the non intractable people, or are you actually trying to sort of figure out how to reach these rural, people that haven't budged?
So I'll give a response that kind of goes back first and then forward, which is, and Ben, you'll probably find some of this trivia elements here pretty interesting, which is, I went to a school that was very much about the intentional fusing of these things. Harding University was mid 20th century, was Harding College in Arkansas, a Church of Christ affiliated school. Also a school that, if viewers didn't know, in the mid 20th century when George Benson took over, became integral to the anti-communist right. We were called, I don't think it was in Newsweek, the Harvard of the far right. It is, thunder. There's multiple articles about this. If you watch like Capitalism Love Story, Michael Moore's the Make Mine Freedom cartoon, produced at Harding. We produced a bunch of anti-communist propaganda at the time. And it's because Benson saved the school financially by saying, basically, I will fuse these ideas. He went to a bunch of, business donors and said, I will produce people who believe in Christian values, the Constitution, and capitalism. And so there was a very conscious fusing, right? He's not the only one who was doing this, but I think it's nice to have the anecdote that I went to a place that was very much part of this sort of project. Also, it was there every day. I went to my school was deeply religious. We went to. I told people there was a point in my life where I was going to church 10 times a week because we had mandatory chapel every morning, Monday through Friday. We had Sunday morning church. You had Sunday evening services. You had a Wednesday night service, and if you were a member of like our versions of frats or sororities, then the week your frat met, you also usually integrated a devotional period. So there was just church all the time. Um, and I think that it's people who don't come from that world, that evangelical world, and now we're talking about the evangelicals who actually, when they say they are in it, right? There's the people who just say it, and what they mean is a certain kind of cultural affinity. But there's also the people who are truly in this. Um, there's just a different way of looking at the world that comes from this. And you mentioned they haven't slipped on Trump. Well, part of that is because, when you think the way a devout evangelical thinks, faith is so important. And what you're supposed to do is believe that things work the way they're supposed to work. That God has a plan. That there are things that may be unpleasant. There are pain points in your life, but these are part of it. These are part of your journey. If it's personal, these are part of your spiritual journey. If it's happening to a community, these are trials, right? But they're not necessarily
Except if
reasons.
the Democrat is in charge, then it's
Oh,
existential.
sure. Then it's apocalyptic. Um, all that to say, you mentioned missionary kids and everything else. Our school very missionary focused as well. We had a big atrium in our Bible building with all the flags that from the country students were from, and well over 100 represented because of largely the missionary work that alums and faculty did. So I think that there's an element in which I retained a certain evangelical spirit. You ask about what we're trying to do. You reach people by being an insider. That's also what like effective missionary work is about too, right? You get there and you really integrate. So
I don't, but that's another whole story.
yeah, right. Whether that works or not is a whole other question. But we're bringing people on intentionally who have a foot in this world. Some of them are still living and operating in it. Some of them grew up in it. We're trying to do things where when we have a conversation and we talk about this stuff, we work, rail against, illiberalism in the South. Southerners are doing it. It's really important that the message is coming from inside the house when we do these things. And that's our attitude elsewhere. There's a reason we brought on some people, the people from regional Australia or from Northern England, because it's when we want to talk about these places, we're really invested in the idea that we're not talking at them or about them, that the conversation is happening from them and with them. And that's essential. You can't have this kind of project and have it work if you're just sort of giving what places like this have always bristled at, which is just sort of missives from on high, from a distance.
So, what is the programmatic activity of the Pulaski Institute? You've sort of described it in passing. We're bringing on X type of people, but what do you guys actually do?
We are doing a few different things. We're trying to do in-person events. Obviously, we just did this thing in Oklahoma. We see a lot of value, obviously, in both organizing, longer conference style things and, kind of one night talks, largely because it brings people together, right? And especially in a region like the South, figuring out there are other people that are also really distraught about what's happening is a huge part of the process. Because those people get in a room together and they actually, connect, they build those networks, but they also feel the salve of just, oh, other people are also really concerned. My experience in the last little bit here of doing this, and last week in Oklahoma especially, is man, people will show up, and not only will they show up, they have a lot to say. They have questions to ask. They're really dying to get involved in making these regions better, and they are desperate for places that offer that kind of locus of connection. So that's one aspect. One of the other things we've done that I think is great, we're going to be bringing it back this year, we've done it in the past, is inviting people to write about the quality of democracy in their state. We're big believers that democracy happens obviously nationally, but a national democracy score can't tell you everything about the civic and democratic life that people are experiencing. And so what we really need to do is try to address the civic life someone actually has when they walk out their front door. Because if that's deteriorating, not only does that mean that what's actually available to any given person in that place is much less, civically and democratically fulfilling, it also tends to flow upward and will affect, right, the national situation over time. So, you mentioned money. One of the things we'd love to do, if we had more resources, is actually build a kind of place-based democracy index that tries to do a more granular approach to what places like Freedom House and VDIM do, because we think that there's an incredible amount of value in understanding, the day-to-day quality of democracy for people in the kind of actual roots in which they're living their lives.
Oh, we've had some questions from the chat about
Sure.
the name Pulaski.
Yeah.
And there's various possible explanations, so we're in suspense as to which one it is.
Well, Pulaski County is the big county in the middle of Arkansas, so there's a geographic element. But when I was contemplating names, and I was kind of like, you got to pick a name, so it's helpful a historical name can sometimes be nice. I thought about it, and I thought, there's actually a lot that I'd like about this connection. Not only is there the geographic thing of it being the big central county in Arkansas, but Casimir Pulaski, being this Polish aristocrat who comes over and fights the American Revolution, I think it really does touch on some of the themes we're really interested in, which is this idea of internationalism and that there's a fight for the sort of values of liberty that transcend national boundaries, and that there's something invigorating about his story. And so, yeah, that's how we kind of settled on it. And so the beginning was kind of just thinking about geography, and then the more I thought about it, I was like, I think this really works as a reference point. So I do get messages every year though from Polish organizations who seem to think we're just commemorating Casimir Pulaski, usually on Pulaski Day, usually in Polish. But we do have a Polish American fellow, Dominik Stetua. And I remember when I asked him his first thing to come on board, his first response was, "Is this a Polish thing?" And I said, "It's not." But
all right. So to the audience, if you have questions, instead of putting them in the chat, which is always a great idea, but an even better idea is to smash that jump on the screen and ask them live thing, because it goes to the whole vibe of this being a conversation. So, feel free to leap in at any time.
It's one of the revolutionary features of the show.
It is one of the revolutionary features of the show that the audience can interrupt at any time. But
because we're a true democracy.
Yeah.
But that, of course, depends on the audience to exercise its prerogatives. Remember that in every democracy, a power that goes unexercised, atrophies over time and lapses into desuetude. So,
just like Southern democracy. While we're waiting for someone,
I see a Western Gate comment, by the way, in the chat.
Let me ask Alan about the since you're international, about the Canadian election. If you were following, you were following it, and I guess Canada, from what I understand, which is very little, also has this heartland kind of aspect to it. So I don't know if you have any comment on what happened up there.
I'm encouraged. I think we'll have to see, the Carney government itself can sustain this flip in the Liberal Party's fortunes for the moment. I hope they can. But yeah, I think, Americans even have a kind of, I think, cartoonized idea of Canada sometimes, right? Like, the Ottawa protest got pretty ugly, right? The trucker protests were pretty ugly. And in a lot of ways looked a lot like some of the stuff that we've seen in the U.S. that is quite worrying. So that's there, right? It's bubbling there. And Poilievre is, these days, especially in the climate of the second Trump administration, calling someone Trump-like can be a little more of a complicated comparison. But there are certainly some pretty nasty populist aspects to his politics. And I think that it's important that this has happened. We're about to see maybe Australia do the same thing this weekend with Peter Dutton, the opposition leader there, uh, also really taking a lot of heat in the context of being negatively compared to Trump. So there could be a little moment. What worries me when these things happen is that there's typically a big rush to say that the populist moment is over. And I just find that to be a bit unsustainable as an argument. We're in a long haul period of contestation, and I think we have to accept that and stop treating every little moment where the populist right is defeated as kind of the end of the story. So I'm excited, but I'm trying not to draw long-term historical
Is
conclusions.
the populist moment ever over? I mean, it feels like it's always there, ripe for the taking. If someone unscrupulous enough wants to seize a mantle, and of course have been left-wing populists as well.
Right.
Is there a good form of populism? Can you have like positive populism, or is that sort of an oxymoron?
It's interesting because I think that I don't necessarily think it's an oxymoron. It just depends on kind of what the word has been fashioned into in the moment, right? Um, I think before Trump, when someone said populist, they weren't necessarily using it to denigrate all the time, right? You could talk about uh, plenty of people as having a kind of populist message, and what you really meant was just they've got a lot of grassroots energy. They're talking about the needs of people outside, in the working class and in these other places. So if what we mean is doing politics in a grassroots way that is trying to bring people together on issues that are maybe more economically progressive, or that's if that's what we mean, then sure, that there's plenty of ways to do populism that are not inherently bad. What I think we've seen is that we live in an era where it's very difficult to put forward, I think, a politics that inherently relies on anger at the establishment, that does not give way to something uglier.
But I think that the thing about populism is that when we like it, we tend to call it something else.
Yeah.
So populism, I think relatively few people call themselves populists, although some do, of course. But it tends to be a disparaging name that people give to movements. For example, if you look at the progressive Republican movement of the early 20th century, the La Follettes, and
Yeah.
I mean, in retrospect, they were of just a very attractive form of populism, I think. And I don't like the instinct to oppose more aristocratic and power formations of money and class. I don't think is like a terrible one, to be honest. The demagogic quality of it, and it does tend to resolve toward demagoguery and anti-institutionalism, is really
Me.
is really pernicious. But I don't think I don't think the instinct of a lot of people in the early 20th century and late 19th century to oppose the power of big railroads and be, trust busters is a bad thing. We just don't call it populist in retrospect. We call it progressivism or Teddy Roosevelt, right?
Right.
But
Institutions are the key in the whole sequence of it. Like the progressives they were taking sort of the needs of the people, but then they were channeling them to durable institutions that would mediate popular outrage and put it into something more constructive and stable.
If we're talking about bad American populism, we probably don't talk enough right now about Huey Long.
Right.
So.
Because it was I mean, it was a genuine fascist movement, but it was a left fascist movement.
Exactly.
Fundamentally. And, it was it was a whole lot of socialistic promises to, free education through the end of time. I mean, it was a lot of things that lefties would like, with a real, murderous package attached to it.
Yep.
Richard.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So I grew up in Tennessee in the mid 60s, or in the 60s and the 70s. And when I was growing up, Tennessee had the feel, and I guess some of the reputation was that it was on the more progressive side for a southern state. And I think that it include places like North Carolina and Kentucky. And then, of course, I moved away in the 80s, and also Tennessee was the state that gave the country Al Gore Jr. And what was surprising to me in the 90s is to watch Tennessee and a lot of other states, like Kentucky and especially North Carolina, go so far away from that sensibility, to the point that in the 2000 election, Al Gore didn't even carry Tennessee. So what, and this was before this is while the shift was happening towards the Republican Party, but what was happening on the ground that was so that these more progressive impulses did not survive?
Well, my mom, by the way, is from Kingston. She grew up there in East Tennessee in the 60s and 70s as well. I'm a big believer. We know the Southern strategy. The book I think is excellent on this is Angie Maxwell's The Long Southern Strategy, which I think takes a much wider historical scope to this process. So I think the political processes we've talked about already are pretty evident, right? You have just a long, steady move, right, of the Republican Party towards the kind of things that Southern voters really want, right? Cultural conservatism, religious conservatism. So economic conservatism matters here, but it's really the other stuff that's important. I think on the ground, a few things. One is you do actually get a kind of revival, not just of religiosity, but of a certain kind of, and this is, I think, where I would reference Matthew Taylor's The Violent Take It by Force, which is this rise in non-denominational charismatic Christianity, particularly in the South, that I think is much, much more politically potent, but also kind of complicated, right? I mean, that's the other thing, right? Like the South in the 60s, you're really talking about like Southern Baptists, Church of Christ, Methodists. I mean, now a lot of times you're talking about these non-denominational, highly charismatic megachurches. And the politics in those places is real weird. Yes, it's conservative, but I do think it's also got this wildly powerful potential to really mobilize people, and you have thousands of people in these sort of arena-like churches. And at the same time, I think it's much more politically ruthless than the evangelical denominations were in the past. So if I was talking about what's happening on the ground, that would be a big part of it to me. Some of it I think also is flight, right? I mean, some southern states did get kind of purple. The New South, the places that were able to brand themselves that way, did pretty well, right? Atlanta and Charlotte and Raleigh have seen an influx both outside of the region, but also in the region of, educated, more sort of liberal-leaning Southerners. On the other hand, what that means is that some of these other places have, in fact, actually managed to become even more conservative, than they were.
Yeah, I mean, it creates a weird dynamic like, Jesse Helms's famous comment, why do we need a zoo in North Carolina? We can just build a fence around Chapel Hill. That sense of really
Right.
profound resentment at the more liberal parts of the state, which of course become both by dint of that liberalism um and um and reinforced by it, um, more affluent, more educated, more, these kind of bastions of what the rest of the state sees as the North and urban elites in these communities, whether they're, you know, metro Atlanta counties or, Research Triangle areas.
Yeah. And I think that's critical, right? Because those places have become really important drivers of change in the states that have them. Obviously, other southern states we have big universities, but you have to understand that the big institutional role of some of these universities in the South is not particularly liberal, right? Ole Miss is not. It has that. There, you can go to places and find a sort of patina of liberalism around the fact that there are professors of sociology, et cetera, who are not red state Republicans. But it is not an institution that sustains liberalism the way that Duke or UNC, Chapel Hill, or even Vanderbilt do. My dad's a Vandy guy, so
And why do you think that's true? So what is, I mean, other than that Old Miss is a, you know, it shows up prominently as nothing like Harvard in The Sound and the Fury, right? I mean, it has this deep resonance in modern Southern history, but that said, it's not obvious to me why it doesn't play the role that Emory University does, or Vandy, or Duke, or Chapel Hill, right? I mean, it's not structurally different.
Mhm.
Why doesn't it? Why doesn't it become like one of the Midwestern land grant colleges?
I do think it is a weird place where I would love, and you could probably have an extended conversation about sports and culture. The SEC is such a strange institution in the way it infuses people's identity here. People put so much of their local cultural identity into our universities down here. And I know it happens in other parts of the country, but I mean, it is life and death for people who have never even set foot on some of those campuses. That is a powerful thing, right? There are people who will live, breathe, die Ole Miss. And even the fact that we're calling it Ole Miss, right? Ole Miss is actually a name that is evocative, right, of its explicitly racist history. Um, and Ole Miss is also a great you can find those fights right there, the fights over the name, over rebels, right? Whether they should change the those. And I should say this, I have some very one of our former board members she's a historian who graduated from there, and obviously there's some very great work being done. I don't want to denigrate the friends I do have at Ole Miss and suggest that it's an inherently reactionary institution.
We are having an Ole Miss professor on the show on Thursday, by the way, a early childhood education
Yeah,
professor.
but I don't think you have to denigrate it to observe that it
Yeah.
is not playing the same role
No, it's true.
in Mississippi that Vanderbilt plays in Tennessee, or
Yeah.
that, the three universities, the universities of the Research Triangle play in North Carolina, which has
Right.
become a complete biomedical research powerhouse, at least until the grants cut off from HHS
Mhm.
ruin all biomedical research. But I mean, it's one of the centers of that kind of research in the world. Look, we got to wrap up.
Yeah.
Alan Elrod, you are a great American, and it is a
We should come
pleasure.
back. This was so interesting.
It is a
I
pleasure to
love
meet you, and you should come back. One of the things about this show is that, once you have been invited once, you have that link. that
Yeah.
will always get you on, and you are invited. It skips the audience and goes straight on screen, and we are live every day, except those days when I cancel the show because I'm going to be on asleep in California. And then on an airplane, and we are live every day between 8 and 9, and you can just show up. And of course, it's probably between 7 and 8 in your part of the country.
The heartland.
In the heartland. Because the heartland is on Central Time.
It's on any time. We sell shirts that say home is where the heartland is, and we sell them for every state.
There you go. Look, so come back and join us. You don't even have to announce that you're showing up. You can just show up. We're going to be back tomorrow. We have a guest tomorrow from the heartland of Finland. We're going to be Alicia will be joining us. I think the estimable Minna Olander will also be joining us. Holly, I suspect, will probably be joining us. She tends to do that sort of thing.
She'll have no life.
Because she has no life.
Jobs and lives.
She has a life at 8 in the morning.
I have nothing of the kind. So
I know you'll be there. I'll be there. It'll be a thing. See you later.
Thank you.